Hello to all my friends in the Netherlands and in Belgium. I'd very much love to be with you, but with these ravages of COVID, we've just come out of 264 days of lockdown here in Melbourne, Australia. So we're partly out, but unfortunately still not able to travel outside the country, or worse, even to return. So I want to come to you today about the status of where the visible learning is researchers. Certainly what I've been doing over the last many years is to continue to collect the meta-analyses. And when I published Visible Learning in 2009, I had 800, and now I'm up to 1,800. People still keep doing the research, which is kind of good. And the graph of distribution of the 300 odd influencers hasn't changed that much. And I still get a sense of wonder when I look at this graph. Because when I started, I never expected to be so few down in that red zone. I expected a lot more. Surely we all know the criticisms of our work in schools, not good enough. But as you can see, there's not many. And quite a few of those influences in the red zone make perfect sense, like the effect size of bullying, minus 0.3, of boredom, minus 0.5. And when you take those into account, 95 to 98% of things that we do to students still enhance achievement. So we have to stop saying, I have evidence that I can enhance achievement, because everyone can. And I want to up the challenge and say, can you get in that blue zone above average? Those students in those schools with those teachers are gaining more than a year's of learning for a year's input. And that's pretty impressive. And the visible learning story is, have we got the courage to reliably identify those teachers and schools in the blue zone, form a coalition of success around them, and then invite those in the yellow zone to join? The hardest thing in education is courage. It is so much easier to worry about all that stuff in the yellow zone. Yes, of course they matter, but relative to what's in that blue zone, nowhere near as much. And the work we've been doing over the last 10 years around the world, and in your part of the world with Basalt, is working in schools to start by showing nicely where you are on that distribution. And then making sure that the biggest issue in our business, which is the within school variability, reducing that to increase all teachers into that blue zone, and ensuring in that process that we continually stop and smell the roses of the success we have. I'm far more interested in identifying success and scaling it up, whereas so often we do the opposite. We love to find failure and fix it. I want success because there's plenty around you. And look at that blue zone. Probably 60% plus of teachers in schools in the Netherlands already in that blue zone. Excellence is all around us. And how we increase the percentage of teachers in schools in that blue zone is what the visible learning story is. The details are not part of today's session, but they're all available now. We created a free website called MetaX. And on that site, we updated it actually about 2 weeks ago to bring it up to 1,700 meta-analyses. All the data's there, frequently asked questions. There's a glossary of terms and many other resources we continue to add to that MetaX site. That's not the detail today. Of course, the detail is important. So what's the big messages? It's these 7. These are the underlying notions of what distinguishes those in the blue from those in the yellow. And when you look down that list, there's not really a student. There's not a curriculum. There's not an age group. There's not a country. What works best? Works best with all students. Of course, your kids are unique. And hence the mantra of know thy impact. Taking the big ideas that are here and making sure that you know the fidelity, the quality of your impact when you implement these ways of thinking in your classroom. And that's the key term, your ways of thinking. It's less about what you do, and it's more about how you think. Take the number one, how you work together with other teachers to evaluate your impact. Of course, that begs the impact question. Impact about what? Impact for whom? And how much impact? And having other teachers critique and give alternative interpretations to build up a common understanding of what we mean by impact is the biggest effect on students, and they're not even in the room. And it does also beg the question about what we mean by evaluative thinking, which is key to that first one. And one of the ways that we can demonstrate our concept of impact is by our high expectations. What do we consider in this class and in the school to be examples of a year's growth for a year's input? As Christian Ruby Davies showed, teachers who have high expectations tend to have it for all the students, and you can see the effect size there is huge. Sadly, those teachers who have low expectations, they also have it for all the students, and they're also successful. So how do we take those high expectations and make them explicit to students? And this is why we're so keen to look at the nature of success criteria. Success criteria about the content of the skills, and success criteria about how we relate and problem solve and have conceptual understanding. And making sure that those success criteria meet the Goldilocks principle of challenge. Not too hard, not too easy, and not too boring. And if we are setting success criteria with appropriate and sufficient challenge, then there's a gap. There's a gap between what the students walk into the class with and where they need to be. And in that gap, they don't know. And this is why we need to make errors, mistakes, not knowing, the critical positive attributes of learning. Failure should be a learner's best friend. No student comes to your class to learn that which they already know. It's what they don't know. And this is why building trust and relationships with students is so critical. Because it's that trust to be able to say, I need help. Help me with my next steps. Give me the feedback. And that feedback then back to teachers about their impact and how we continually seek that feedback impact about what we taught well and what we didn't teach well, who we taught well and who we didn't teach well, and how much we taught. And continually asking that question improves our skills as teachers such that students are the beneficiaries. And then there's that relentless focus on learning and getting the right proportions at the right time about surface and deep. So underlying all this is this notion of expertise. Now, 2009, when I produced that book, as I said, 800 meta-analyses. Since then, I have been very busy. Lots more books coming out, my colleagues working on these things, trying to take that database and look at it from multiple different perspectives. And so as we go along and look at the work we do in schools, the team that are employed in the schools know about the implications from this. And you can see some of those books related to how we teach in distance. And then the rebound series was how we can learn from what we did in distance learning during COVID to bring back to the regular classroom. But I want to come back and highlight some of the major findings from all this work. And it's this notion of knowing thy impact. This walking into a classroom and saying, my job here today is to evaluate my impact. Impact about what? For whom and how much? And underlying that notion of walking into a classroom are various mind frames, various ways of thinking. And we've explored these various ways of thinking for teachers and school leaders. And you can see the 10 mind frames there. And probably the hardest one that we have to do in our implementation work is number 4. Teachers are change agents. And sometimes getting teachers to take credit for the change they're making in students is very, very hard. Of course, we know it's easy to blame teachers, but it's the opposite that we're interested in. How do we get teachers to think about how they went about successfully teaching this student or that student, this concept or that concept, and learning from that so we can scale up that success. And building up that relation and trust and that focus on the language of learning. In our next book, we're looking at the Mindframes for parents. And you can imagine I'm quite proud of this book. It's because I wrote it with my son. It took us about 5 or 6 years, and it was a really good, fun exercise to do. And it's coming out very, very shortly. And again, it's trying to look at what are the Mindframes for parents. And we're arguing that parents are not. They're students' first teachers. They're their first learners. It's your role to be the teacher. And there are skills involved in being teachers. And many parents don't have those skills to be a teacher. But every parent can have a love of learning and a language of learning in the home that complements, supports what we're doing in our school system. I want to look for a moment then, in light of the research we've been doing, at what happened during COVID. And here in Melbourne, 264 days later, we came out of lockdown last Friday, somewhat. We were only allowed to travel a certain amount of distances and the usual masks and double vaxxing and all those considerations. But we had a lot of experience at what happened in schools during both the distance learning, the hybrid learning. When students came back, some came back, some didn't. It was an incredible situation. And that happened right throughout the world. I'm yet to find a single policy, government decree, superintendent decree, department decree, that's come down to schools to tell them how to teach and how learning occurs during COVID, other than whether schools should open or not. I think it's fascinating. This has been the greatest educator-led revolution in my lifetime. Schools have worked out ways to do it. I would argue we saw more collective efficacy during COVID as principals concerned and worried about how teachers were going, making sure teachers had the right resources, were having the kind of impact that they wanted to have, connecting them with other teachers. Principals worked with school leaders in other schools to find out what they were doing. And we had a real generative evidence of having that collective efficacy across schools and between schools. But pause for a moment and think, why are we going to rush back to the old normal and worry for the raindrops of policies to keep coming down to our schools? Why can't we harness that incredible effort that we have demonstrated over the last 1.5 to 2 years, showing that we can work together to really improve the quality of learning for our students from an educator-led revolution? And why did we succeed? And I'm going to show you in a moment that we did succeed in successfully teaching students during the COVID teaching. It's because of you. You were the change agents. Let's look at some of the evidence. Believe it or not, there's already a meta-analysis. My colleague Klaus Zara, we published that 10 Mindframes book a couple of years ago. He has completed a meta-analysis, not a big one, 12 studies, 5 million kids. And you can see the average effect about -0.1 or -0.17. Now, let's be clear what that means. That doesn't mean kids went backwards. It means compared to the normal trajectory of learning over a year, that trajectory was not quite as steep as previous years. And think about it. All the people who come out with warnings, all those headlines about loss of learning and COVID's terrible and all these kind of things. On average, not much happened. That effect size is about the same size as what kids lose in learning over summer. And you know you can pick that up reasonably quickly. And so I want you to pause and ask, how come, despite the disruption, and I'm certainly not arguing that we should stay at distance learning, not at all, but despite all that, educators came up with some ways so that learning continued almost to the level of previous years. I think it's a really worthwhile exercise for each school to work out the things that worked well. Of course, you can look at the things that don't work well and say, how are we going to bring those ideas back into our regular classroom? Let me give you another study in New Zealand. They had quite a remarkable data set where they looked at the performance of the students in 2020 compared to the previous 10 years of data across the system. And you can see reading went down slightly, mathematics went up. Writing went down appreciably, primarily because writing requires surveillance and that was harder to do in distance learning. But once again, the effects are not that different. When I look at the social and emotional learning study I've been involved in, it didn't start out looking at COVID. It was not predicted when we started. We were doing another study, but COVID came along on our second intervention of studies, and we were able to put our third at the end of COVID when kids came back out of lockdown, and then we did a follow-up 3 months later. And yeah, on average, depression went up and well-being went down. But the minute we came out of COVID, it snapped back. Now, I got a little worried when I first saw this thing, saying, wait a moment, if you look at the figures before COVID, what percentage of kids had major anxiety and depression concerns? And the longitudinal studies all say about the same number, about 9 or 10%. So what if those kids are hidden in the average? So we pulled them out. We got the opposite to what I expected. See, on this depression, those who had the greatest amounts of depression before COVID actually did better in COVID. But some of those kids that weren't that depressed started to get a little depressed in COVID. And similarly on well-being, it was the exact opposite. Those who had the lowest level of well-being actually improved during COVID. So don't presume. Be careful when students come back to your class. Don't put kids into the usual categories with the usual labels. Check to see what their trajectory of learning was and follow up on that. And when you look at what students are saying about COVID, it's probably no surprise to any of us that the biggest issue for them was friendship. And hey, students like coming to school to be with their friends. Yeah, we want more than that. But that's what they missed, which is why the distance learning is not the optimal solution. But many of the attributes of the power of visible learning we saw coming to the attention during COVID. We saw those teachers who are able to gradually release responsibility. Those students who are more prepared to learn how to be their own teachers. Those students who had the skills of working in groups were the ones that succeeded. Those students who most depended on the teacher had the largest troubles, regardless of their prior ability. And some of our students who were smartest in the regular classes didn't do well in COVID because they overly depend on teachers, and we overly love to have them depend on us. So how can we learn from an incredible experiment that no one planned, no one would have got permission to actually undertake, but happened, and understand what made the difference such that the trajectory in that COVID teaching wasn't so much different to any other year? And I ask you to have those discussions in your school. And the reason that the trajectory wasn't that different was because of what you did. And I think we should take credit for that. And I hope the community is the same. At the moment, I think parents have the highest esteem of the expertise of teachers they've ever had as they've struggled to deal with their one or two preciousness, and realizing that some of you in high school, for example, have 200 students a day for 200 days a year, and you do a lot more than babysitting. I think this is a wonderful time to esteem the expertise of teachers. What is that expertise? Well, this is what we're exploring in our work at the moment, and we call it evaluative thinking. Remember that very first one. How do we evaluate our impact? This is the evaluative thinking. And it's this notion of reasoning and critical thinking, which is so much more powerful when we do it with our colleagues. As we hear them checking our biases, checking the fidelity of how we go about implementing, making sure we're looking for the unintended consequences. It's not just the students who do well demonstrate we do a great job. It's the students who don't do so well that we have to understand how we can scale up what we were successful at to all the students. It's continually asking about what we mean by impact, checking that the students understand our success criteria, not just putting them up on the wall and having a session with them, but do they have a concept of what success looks like? And that number 5, the hardest one of the lot, understanding in other people's shoes, standing in other people's shoes as a teacher for another teacher, standing in your students' shoes. And to do that, we probably are going to have to stop talking and do a lot more listening as to how the students are going about solving the problems, dealing with their mistakes, working with others. And this is the work that we want to continue on evaluative thinking. Last year, we actually produced a book arguing that the essence of the profession was in evaluative thinking, and we finished it before COVID came along. Wow, did COVID demonstrate that incredible power that you experienced during COVID, where you had to continually ask about what is the optimal opportunities here, what is it the students already know and don't know, how do I add value? In COVID teaching, you could not stand up front, talk for 90% of the time, ask 200 questions that require less than 3 read responses, and focus 90% of the time on just the content. I think we have a lot to learn. We know about this power of collective advocacy, those teachers working together. And a few years ago, I said to the team, I wonder what would happen if we thought of the notion of collective student efficacy. Now, there's not really a concept out there at that time, and obviously there's not a lot of research specifically on collective student efficacy. But there's a lot of research pointing to it. So we spent a bit of time and we worked, and as you can see there, we published our book last year on collective student efficacy. And a lot of it came by looking at what employers are asking for over the last 50 years. And you can replace maths in there with English or music or panel beating. It doesn't make much of a difference. And you can see those students who have high content area and high social skills are very employable and continue to be so. And no surprise, those with low content and low social skills are not. But look in the middle. Those students with lower content but higher social skills, their employment rate's gone up. But those students with higher content and lower social skills have gone down. So if I came into your classroom, would I see your students sitting together, working alone? Would I see all the assessments be done individually by student? This is what we need to change if you're going to make your students employable. Can your top math students talk to your English students and vice versa? Because employers are saying, we want team workers. We want those who can communicate and translate. If they don't have the content, particularly in the specialised world, we can fix that. But at age 18, 19 or 25, 26, if they don't have the ability to work in teams, it's too hard. So are you making your students employable? And this is why we looked at collective student efficacy. And we're arguing it's a lot more than just putting kids in groups and giving them group assignments. There are skills. There are skills about how you work in groups. There's skills about turn taking. There's a sense of confidence that a person can contribute to the group. And the hardest, that confidence that the group can come up with a better answer than any individual. That's social sensitivity. And we also looked at the various tasks, some more conducive to collective efficacy and some not. We looked at what you needed to have in those prior content knowledge before you went in to collective assignments. You need at least a success criteria for the individual and one for the group, and similarly assessment. You do need assessment of group work, you need assessment of the individual's work, and you need an assessment of the individual's contribution to the group. Not easy stuff, but this is so critical if we're going to make our students employable in our current world, not future world, our current world. And so looking at how that we translate both the teacher collective efficacy and student collective efficacy has been one of our tasks over the last few years. And as we go about working on visible learning, plus in our schools, implementing it in those contexts. We also have this focus on learning. And we've spent a lot of time building a model of learning and trying to understand what we mean by learning. We start by going into schools and asking the students, what does it mean to be a learner in this class? Who's the best student? Who's the best learner in this class, and why are they the best learner? And some of the answers are a little frightening. Okay? Students say, look, the best, being a learner in this class, come prepared, sit up straight, and watch the teacher work. The compliance is far too strong. Learning's messy. Learning's hard work. And so we looked at synthesizing all the different learning strategies we could find. And as we started to do this, we got into this problem that one strategy works very well in one context, but doesn't work well in another context. So working out what those contexts were led us to build this model, that as a student walks into a class, they come in with certain skills, with certain dispositions or wills, and certain motivations or thrills. We want to also enhance those three as outcomes. And as students are first exposed to material, the content, the surface knowledge, when they first start to acquire that, there are various strategies that work. And then they change the strategies when they then have to consolidate and overlearn that content so they can move on to the deeper thinking, the relational, the conceptual, the extending, and consolidate that deep knowledge so they can move then to transfer it to similar and to other tasks. And when you look at the various strategies, you can see they differ a lot. Let me just start with outlining and summarizing. And my challenge to you is in your next class is to say to the students, all right, I'm going to talk to you for 10 or 15 minutes. During that time, I want you to take notes, summarize, and outline. And I'm going to collect it in. Have a look at the skills the students have at outlining, summarizing. Some of them will hand in a blank piece of paper. Worse, some of them will hand in a verbatim script of everything you said, which means there's no processing. And then ask, what's it like to sit there and hear someone talk and all the stuff is incoming? Unless you have coat hangers, unless you have summarizing skills, then it's just data. And no surprise, many students get turned off very quickly. Some students don't know how to pick up the important parts. They think everything's important, and it's not. It's a hierarchy. So how do we get and teach the skills of outlining and summarizing? And this is the work we're doing at the moment as to how we can get smarter about identifying what it means to be a good learner in the school, what it means to have progress in our learning. I think it's fascinating that you have at your fingertips thousands, if not tens of thousands of measures of achievement. But how many measures of learning have you got? Not easy, but I think it's the right debate. It's interesting when you then match up that model of learning with all the different teaching methods. And Bob Mazzano produced a book, 480 different teaching methods, and we then assigned as a group those teaching methods to those 5 different parts of the learning cycle. And you can see not many remain. 400 we had to throw out. They're random. That gives no guidance to students about the kind of strategies used as part of the teaching. And only 1 or maybe 2, the jigsaw and the Padilla method, that crossed all 5 different levels. I just think that's interesting that there isn't a great alignment between our teaching methods and our learning cycle. More work to be done there. And the challenge we set ourselves as we were writing up our work was to say, let's look at some real life examples. And we happen to have about 20,000 hours of teacher transcripts of classes. And the question was, how many times did a teacher deliberately try and understand a learning strategy or actually talk about their own and give an alternative strategy? After 4,000 hours, we gave up. None. What's it in your class? How do we make learning the essence of what we do? And so what we're working on at the moment is this notion of constructive alignment, making sure we've got the right intervention at the right time, at the right level of complexity, making sure we've got the right teaching methods aligned to the learning, aligned to the success criteria, aligned to the assessments, and making it crystal clear to the students about what we expect them to learn, what success looks like, teaching them the various strategies along with the content, and exploring all that particularly in a collective situation as well as each individual by themselves. And this is the essence of what we're trying to do in all our implementation of visible learning. So right at the moment, as you can see, I'm thoroughly enjoying continuing to explore the database. We've certainly spent 10 years implementing the model across schools, and we have the data from all those schools, many tens of thousands of schools now across the world, looking at how to be smarter at implementing visible learning. And I encourage you to Explore with your colleagues about your concepts of knowing thy impact. And sometime soon, I truly hope I can be back in person in the Netherlands, in your wonderful country. Thank you.